But we've got a great final panel for the conference, and I'm going to introduce our speakers as they come to the stand. So I'll begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Roxana Cristalli, who will be delivering a talk titled Watching the Forest Breathe, Love, Place and the Politics of Attention. Dr. Cristalli is a lecturer at the University of St. Andrews. Her research and teaching focus on feminist peace and conflict studies, as well as the politics of nature and place. She is currently the co-principal investigator of a research project on the politics of love in the wake of loss. Her book, Good Victims, The Political as a Feminist Question, was published just last week by Oxford University Press. Thanks, Roxana.
Thank you all, and thank you for that beautiful talk, which I'm still digesting myself. Thank you to Alison and Ruth for having us, and to all of you for such a moving and nourishing and enlivening exchange. I've learned so much. I've come to you with an offering from the very early stages of a research project, so I don't have insights or findings or worse outputs to share with you, just some ideas and questions that I'm currently living in. And the seeds of this research actually lie in my own failure to pay attention. And the origin story of this research is actually in my life outside of the academy. For the past 14 years, I've worked as a peace-building practitioner before I was an academic, and then alongside my academic work, in places like Colombia, Uganda, Syria, primarily with women affected by war. And so that, on a day-to-day basis, looked like working with former combatants in armed groups to document their gendered experiences of violence, or with people who identified themselves as victims to understand how their interactions with bureaucracy sometimes entrenched that sense of victimhood. And wherever I went looking for stories of violence and victimhood and harm, there was always a shadow story that I failed to pay adequate attention to. And it was invariably a shadow story of love. So combatants talking about how they loved the jungle, the natural environment in which they were hiding as guerrilla fighters, and that love of the jungle made it actually really difficult to demobilize, to lay down their weapons and go live in a city in the aftermath. Refugees talking about crushes that they developed in an informal settlement in Greece. People speaking of neighborly love, familial love. It's not that love was absent, it's that I had failed to pay adequate attention to it. And we can speculate as to why that is, particularly in academia, but I'm not interested in dwelling and lamenting. I'm interested in asking how might our relationship to our work be different if we place that love center stage? How might our understanding of politics, of loss, of what sustains life be different if we learn an attentiveness to love and care? I was very fortunate that my dear friend Philip Schultz at the University of Bremen was preoccupied and haunted by similar questions. And so together we decided to take this work on and to see if what Carolyn Nordstrom calls a different kind of war story might emerge from that kind of focus. The image that you're looking at here is a heart made of beer bottle caps in one of the combatant demobilization zones in Colombia. And the image in this slide is Philip, who's capable of taking an adult photo without looking like a grinning teenager, and his co-principal investigator, who evidently is not. So our preoccupation with these questions started as the article that you see here, Taking Love and Care Seriously, an Emergent Research Agenda in the Wake of Violence, and then became the project that I've come to speak to you about today, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the German Research Foundation. The animating questions of this project are how can focusing on relations and practices of love and care illuminate the effects of violence and harm? And I don't mean here that we're looking for a new typology or taxonomy of harms on the basis of love. What I mean is something far simpler and far harder. How might we understand what people lost if we followed what and whom they loved? How might we understand what people loved if we followed their sense of loss and their sense of grief? How can focusing on relations and practices of love and care illuminate the nature of repair? What might repair look like in an environment of ongoing grief? How can focusing on relations and practices of love and care illuminate what helps people survive, and here I put in italics, and thrive in the face of loss? Thriving is my latest obsession, and in one of my home disciplines, I'm a feminist anthropologist in a school of politics and international relations for my sins. In one of those environments, thriving seems inappropriate, impossible to imagine, as though speaking about flourishing is invalidating harm. But in fact, in the lives of the people whose stories I will share with you in a moment, flourishing, in part through relations and practices of love and care, is what pulls them through time. So I'm interested in love and care not only as long as they get us to the baseline of survival, which is a very difficult baseline, but also in what they can do to help us imagine a deeper, richer, lighter, more textured life, a life of thriving and flourishing. And finally, the last question, perhaps the most important for me, is how can focusing on relations and practices of love and care illuminate politics and the political? Several of us over the course of this conference have said that love is political. And I'm interested in the next sentence. What kind of political? What kind of politics does love generate? Does it illuminate? What kind of anti-politics of love do we see showing up in our stories? So I'm not interested in the political as a declaration. I'm interested in the political as a question, which is indeed the subtitle of my book, Good Victims, and in understanding the political as potentially reimagined through practices of love and care. An ethic and methodology of alongsideness guides this project, and I want to tell you a little bit about that alongsideness. A lot of it has been inspired by Eve Tuck, who's a native scholar and activist. And if you don't know Eve Tuck's work, I think this is one of the most beautifully written pieces I have encountered. It's called Suspending Damage, A Letter to Communities. And you'll forgive me for turning my back on you, but I didn't bring my glasses to look at the other screen, so here we are. Tuck started with a preoccupation that damage-centered research invites people to only speak from that space in the margin that is a sign of deprivation, a wound, an unfulfilled longing. And Tuck became really worried about how that singular focus on war, on violence, on what people lost, on their suffering, actually flattens their experiences, their relationships, the way they imagine the world. I should also probably tell Alan I can't see the clock, so it would help if we would count down. Thank you. And so some of why we're interested in relations and practices of love and care is as a way of resisting that fetishization of violence and harm that Tuck invites us to consider. Secondly, we're considering love and care alongside harms, not instead of them. I'm very concerned about love washing. I don't want this to be a project of toxic positivity, of we're here to say, but Ukrainians also plant flowers while refusing to help them, right? Very much what you were saying. I'm very interested in and committed to the flowers, but I'm also committed to the dead, and I'm interested in death. And so being able to hold the flowers and the dead, the love and the suffering in one embrace is part of what an ethic and methodology of alongsideness entails. And I will now blatantly contradict myself by saying that I also worry about that ethic, because every time I've given this talk or a version of this talk, I end up defending the focus on love only through its proximity to suffering, to death, to loss, as though love only matters, as though we can only take love seriously if it sits next to death, if it can gain its seriousness, its credibility, its gravity from its proximity to death. And so I also want to invite us, and chiefly myself, to focus on love and care without caveats. Not just love and care in the middle of war, not just love and care alongside suffering, but love and care full stop, because they matter, because they are some of what sustains life. It is usually at this point in the talk that someone, usually a political scientist, will say, what do you mean by love and care? How would you define love and care? And then a little bit of my soul dies. I'm a feminist scholar, so some of what I mean by love and care is, what do you mean by love and care? I'm not interested in predefining them, in locking them down and pinning them down and draining the life from them on the page, but I'm interested in how people practice love and care and how they imbue these practices with meaning. But I think some interpretive frameworks help. So in the first instance, Philip and I think of love and care as active practices, not just as passive emotions, not just as feelings. And in that, we are also inspired by Bell Hooks, who I think is joyfully rolling in her grave today with all the references, in thinking about love as something that people do, love as work. And so I'm interested in understanding, what do people do when they are loving and caring? And what work does that love and care do in the world? Secondly, we're thinking about love and care as relational, and as also including non-human or other than human or more than human life forms. And that's the portion of the project you'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. So what does it mean to love a place? To feel loved by a place? What does it mean to love a burning world? What does it mean to love birdsong in the face of the tremendous loss and extinction of birds? And in that, we've been really inspired by Animal Intimacies, which is a gorgeous anthropological text on loving animals that I highly recommend to you. It's on the slide. And finally, I want to question the and. Love and care can be a little bit like women and children, one word, right? And so we know, as anyone who's ever been in a marriage, that love sometimes doesn't go hand in hand with care. And we also know, as anyone who's ever been in a hospital knows, that care doesn't require love. And so we are prepared for love and care to not always go together. But my interest, again, is really not taxonomical. I'm not interested in saying this is love and this is care. The reason we're examining both is because those are the terms in which our interlocutors live them. And they cohabitate with other terms like desire, like intimacy, like affection, like carelessness, like lovelessness or feeling unloved. And of course, they are steeped in contradictions, and the contradictions are part of what makes that story interesting. And then life happened. When Philip and I proposed this project, when we applied for this grant, we said it would be about love and care in the wake of war, and the story was very similar to the story that I've told you so far. In the time that it took for the funding agency to decide whether we got the money and for the project to begin, Philip had 2 whole human children, which tells you how long it takes to get a grant. You can bring 2 children into the world while a funding agency deliberates. And I became life-alteringly ill, which I still remain. And I don't think you can go through those experiences of bringing life into the world and also losing a version of your own life and still ask the same questions that you did before, because you're not allowing yourself to be permeable to life. And so the project required a massive rethinking, both logistically, because it became impossible for me to spend time in war zones as it was before, but also ethically, emotionally, to keep up with our own curiosity. And so it now looks a little bit like this. On the one hand, and with tremendous support from people who are stepping in to do the work I can no longer do, especially Maria Fernanda Olartesiera in Colombia, we're still looking at love and care in the wake of war in Colombia and in Uganda. And we're speaking to the exact same interlocutors that Philip and I have spoken to over the past 15 years in each country. We thought it would be better to speak to the people we have spoken to about war and debt and injustice and ask them about love, rather than seek new interviewees who are experts on love, because again, that alongsideness is some of what we're interested in. So those would be the people in the left column. But we also found it essential to broaden our curiosity beyond violence to other forms of loss. So one component of the project looks at relations and practice of love and care in the wake of mass grief. Another in the wake of illness and disability, particularly working with people affected by long COVID. Yet another looks at love and care in the face of ecological losses, from habitat loss and destruction, extraction, losses resulting from climate change, and so on. In the next 12 minutes, I won't be able to tell you about all of them, so if something sounds really interesting to you and I don't get to it, please ask me about it. What unites all of these forms of loss is gratefully indebted to Christina Sharp's frame of The Wake. If you haven't read In the Wake on Blackness and Being, it's another really gorgeous book. And Sharp gets us to question the idea of the aftermath. She says there is no after when it comes to these systemic losses. And we have to look at the wake like the wake of a ship or the wake after a funeral in order to understand how these kinds of losses shuffle time and our sense of self, who we are, and what we love. So I'm now going to share just a couple of insights from the early days of this project. One component of the project now is grounded very near my home, which is itself really beautiful because I've never actually directed my own love through research towards the place at which I live. I've always gotten on a plane to do my job, or this part of my job. And so I am spending time in the company of people who love and care for nature and place. This raises a really interesting question of how do you anthropologically study love? And I have actually found it much harder to observe love than I've found it to observe violence. And I invite us to think about why it is that love and care actually resist the research gaze or unfold in spaces that require a little bit of creativity. And so in practice, I'm spending time in the company of people who pay very close attention to nature and place. Birders, farmers, foresters, sea watchers, a weather watcher, which I think is the coolest thing ever, estate managers. And one of the gifts that they have given me is you can't watch people paying attention. You have to pay it alongside them. You can't watch a birder watching a bird. You yourself are looking at a bird, and that is indeed a gift. And one of them said to me when I asked him, how did you learn to pay attention, and what might the relationship be between attention and love? And here I quote, "Attention has tending at the heart." I love that. There are a couple of things I want to unpack in that little snippet. One is that love in these conversations often starts as a follow-up question. I live in Scotland now, which I call home. And if you tell people in Scotland, I'm interested in speaking to you about love as part of a research project, they will hide in the nearest hole from which they never wish to emerge. And so when you say to them, I want to speak to you about attention and nature and place, they're not as daunted. And my initial question is always, how did you begin to pay attention? And then love always comes up as a follow-up. We will be walking in the woods, and one of them will say, I love this forest. And then I will be the annoying person who says, what do you mean by that? What does this love look like? And I'm very interested in love as a follow-up question, in love as in having to listen for love rather than ask about it directly, like staring at the sun. So what all of these interlocutors have in common is a deep conviction that you have to notice the presence of life in order to notice the absence or the loss of life. When I ask them, what is your earliest memory of climate change? They all have a specific moment, a specific turning point that they can recall. And it's never, I read the blah, blah, blah report on this date. It's in the summer of 1997, the turtle doves didn't come back. And you only know the turtle doves didn't come back if you knew there were turtle doves that lived near you, if you knew to listen for them, if you marked your own sense of time by that. So for this group of interlocutors, love and care require and rely on iterative acts of attention. And that means we cannot really mourn the world or act to end the things that we hope to prevent that cause the mourning without getting to know the world, without noticing the world. The second insight I would like to share with you relates to flourishing. And you're looking at sweet peas in my garden this time last year, or a little bit, maybe 11 months ago. I was recently in Colombia where Maria Fernanda and I were speaking to forensic anthropologists involved in exhumations of mass graves. And the question we were asking them is, what gets you out of bed in the morning? What enables that kind of work to go on when you are literally steeped in mass death? It is not a metaphor. You wake up, you're surrounded by human remains. And they all emphasized the importance of flourishing, not surviving, but having visions of flourishing. They all spoke about the importance of beauty in their lives, the importance of humor, the importance of tending to something outside of yourself, even if it's tending to strangers. And I find it so interesting that so many of my colleagues, and even I myself, often start from a mentality of impossibility. You can't do this in academia. You can't talk about flourishing. You can't talk, we just lower the bar of our own imagination. So I'm really grateful for and intrigued by the ways in which people who have experienced tremendous loss emphasize that what practices of love and care do is enable an imagination of flourishing. Whether you attain the flourishing is actually immaterial. It's the imagination that pulls people through time. And so as the research went on in Columbia, the clunky question simplified to the question of what makes for a good life. And again, that question becomes an accountability compass, because you can't ask your interlocutors what makes for a good life if you're not prepared to ask yourself what makes for a good life. As a general feminist ethical principle, you shouldn't be asking someone a question you yourself would not answer in a similar interview. And I'm very heartened and also puzzled and also troubled by my own inability to answer it, and by the fact the questions on love and care and the questions of what makes for a good life go together. And to learn to answer the question of what makes for a good life, I need to dismantle my own mentality of impossibility. Or to quote one of these forensic anthropologists, pathologists in Columbia, the question needs to be, what if we did? What if we lived? What if we grieved? What if we flourished? As opposed to, but what about? Followed by whatever negative thing we're going to say. And finally, in the concluding 5 minutes, I want to return to the question I started with, which is, what kind of politics is this? If love and care is political, what kind of politics does it bring to the fore? Does it make possible? The first emerging answer is that it is a politics that insists on what sustains life. And of course, there's a shadow parenthesis there, that if you're going to insist on what sustains life, you need to be really clear-eyed about what threatens life, what gets in the way of it, right? That's, again, that ethic and methodology of alongsideness. And so that requires different work from researchers, from humans, from all of us, to turn our curiosity not just towards what takes life away and threatens it, but towards what sustains it. Secondly, it is a kind of politics that requires, inspires, demands even, a commitment to the work of tending and to paying attention. This is very difficult work. I teach a class on the politics of nature and place, and my students will very often know a whole lot about climate change and the world that we're losing, but will not be able to identify a robin that's flying past our window. And again, I'm not interested in them learning the Latin names of plants or any of the hierarchies they're steeped in, but I'm interested in them knowing and loving the world that we're surrounded by, in part in order to care for it and to protect it. And again, my interlocutors get us to think about this being a political kind of noticing. Third, it is a politics that can hold alongsideness, that does not treat love as a threat to action to end injustice, but as an essential ingredient, that does not treat flourishing as a threat to ending inequality, but as a necessary imagination. And then finally, it is a politics that holds together an attempt to both practice surrender to everything that hurts, to everything that we've lost and are losing, and imagine living with a sense of possibility. And what's so difficult about that end is that both surrender and imagination can be totalizing. They can take everything out of you. And so holding them together is a much trickier project than I had imagined. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.